Okay, I don't know for sure if this is going to work because the light is probably going to go and my dog is making a bunch of noise chewing a moose antler behind me. But assuming that the audio comes out well, this will get published. So, this is a video I've been wanting to make for a little while. I've been thinking about how to explain this concept for a while. It's about this idea of spiritual streams, as I call them, and it's generally referred to in anthroposophy. And the concept is that names change over, or let's say names stay the same, but the essence or the content behind the name changes over time. And we know this just from understanding how language evolves over time. You'll see that a word might have had some mm, essence or inflection 100 years ago that it no longer has, or a contemporary word has an inflection now that it no longer has. And there are many obvious examples of that. Slang is also an example of that, which would be the words emerging. So, but it points to this thing about human language being just a pointer to the actual thing in itself, which the human language is indicating. And so we have these names for spiritual essences, or as they appeared at a point in time. And that's the particular thing that I'm most interested in looking at with this presentation. So let's add the PDF. So here we go. What do I mean by spiritual stream? We hear about spiritual movements. Anthroposophy is one. The Theosophical Society, some New Age movements. We also hear about political movements and cultural movements. These are all what we could understand have these same characteristics, which is they have an essence, they have an archetype, they have a worldview, and there are leaders, and then there are spiritual guides. And even political movements and cultural movements, of course, have spiritual leaders, meaning archangels or angels, who are helping the human beings who are enacting things on this plane. And it's important to be able to discern when the genuine essence of a spiritual stream has changed. So I'm very connected to the anthroposophical spiritual stream as described by Rudolf Steiner. And I'm not really that connected to the anthroposophical mainstream of today. Other than that, I know a lot of people who are interested in it. But there's a whole world of Waldorf schools and the Goetheanum and these things that are part of the official anthroposophical context that I'm not connected to. I'm connected to the books and what was happening 100 years ago. And what I'm curious about, I ask myself a lot, is where is that stream now? Now, I mean, 100 years is really not that long. You can pretty much track it. But if you were to try to understand, like, where the stream of King Arthur is now, or where the stream of the Knights Templar is now, that that would be very difficult because it's not going to be whatever has maintained that name. You'd need to track it, and it's going to change every 50 or 100 years. In exoteric life, in political life, a perfect example of something that has changed meaning almost 100% in the past 50 years is the word liberal. It's gone from classical liberal, which refers to something from 50 to 75 years ago, to what we use the word to mean in modern day America. And this is true of how the word has changed meaning in such a dramatic way that we now have another set of words to explain the difference: classical liberal versus contemporary liberal. So all political movements, all social movements, all cultural movements, these they emerge at a specific point in time, and then the essence of them at that point in time seems like it might get applied to something 50, 100 years, 200 years in the future, but that's actually almost never true. And for people who are interested in really understanding the essence of a spiritual movement, you want to understand what it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, or longer, and where it is now. So just talking in the contemporary world, in this amongst spiritual streams, here are some Western spiritual streams that you've probably heard of: esoteric Christianity, which has several different flavors; Theosophy, as in the Theosophical Society; Anthroposophy; Rosicrucianism; Freemasonry; what I'm calling like the Gurdjieff stream, which is associated with several Russian esotericists. They have something they call Christian esotericism. That's it has a very different flavor than the European Christian esotericism. And then this big word, New Age, which has many, many flavors today, of course. Some that I've been kind of encountering recently are what I see in human design or the gene keys, and I think it's really fascinating content. And when I look at it, I think of it as almost Theosophical Society of today, because this is going to be perhaps controversial. It doesn't recognize the Christ being as fully as something like Anthroposophy or esoteric Christianity. I'll speak about this a little more, but the primary split between the Theosophical Society and Anthroposophy was recognition of the actual Christ being. So, how do these streams come into culture? Typically, a highly developed or spiritually powerful person provides the impetus or the impulse. And there are human beings who are many incarnations ahead of the average person. And why they're ahead? It could be because they've worked on spiritual matters in a particular way through many lifetimes, or it could be that they've literally had many more incarnations. In the anthroposophical point of view, as Rudolf Steiner described it, and he was talking 100 years ago, the average time between incarnations for the European people he was talking to at that point in time was 500 to 1,000 years. And typically, a person would be one gender, or a woman in one incarnation and then a man in the next. And so an individual would have the chance to experience the world from those two perspectives, and they would also have the chance to experience the world as it has changed in a particular way throughout those incarnations. Steiner, at various points, indicated that there would be people who had more frequent incarnations. Sometimes that would be because that person was very advanced, and sometimes it would be because they were not advanced. The ability to, according to Steiner, the ability to participate fully in the time in between death and rebirth, meaning the time in the spiritual world, was only possible if a person had spent enough time or enough of their focus on during incarnated earth life on spiritual matters. And if they didn't spend that time on spiritual matters, then they would end up sort of senseless or without an ability to gain much from the time between death and rebirth. So we understand that one could be incarnating frequently because a person is advanced and is able to continue to incarnate frequently to be of service to others, or because one needs to be incarnated in order to gain experience. So one of the terms that was used in anthroposophy is this idea of masters, and masters are human beings, not avatars and not angels. They're human beings who are very advanced. And by that we mean, significantly more advanced than the average spiritually capable person. And those masters are guiding all of humanity. At different points, there was a discussion about the 12 masters who were guiding all of humanity. And you've heard, no doubt, the phrase Black Lodge and White Lodge. And these ideas are representative of the fact that there are human beings who are working either for the betterment of humanity or they're working for selfish purposes. And this is why it's, when looking at a spiritual stream, you really want to look at its comprehension of morality. So if a spiritual stream is very focused on, essentially the self without any interest in the group, then that would be amoral or immoral. There's the famous line from Aleister Crowley, which was "Do as thou wilt," which basically implies, it is the individual overall. And yet, it is necessary for the individual to develop themselves in order to be of service to others. So there is this dichotomy that's very easy to misunderstand if one doesn't have a updated conception of morality. So Aleister Crowley was working as a Satanist. He was working in what could be called a Black Lodge or black magic, gray magic. Yet, as always, one of the reasons that happens is because part of what is being said, only part of it, is appealing to someone and rings as true. And the truth is that in order to actually be of service to others, you do have to develop, one needs to develop oneself. So I have written, corruptions and diversions. What can very easily happen in a spiritual group or a spiritual stream is when the original leader dies or passes out of incarnation, the stream, which represents an essence of power, is almost immediately corrupted or diverted by, let's say, demonic forces working through human beings that want to gain that power for themselves. And in that case, of course, I'm talking about, let's say it was a beneficial spiritual stream. And this is why so frequently, even if there has been something really good about a spiritual stream or a cultural movement or whatever, within a couple decades, it has changed dramatically. It represents an essence of power, and it is very challenging to keep that power pure and uncorrupted, especially if the person carrying the original impulse dies. One of the ways that I, of course, estimate things is by from a esoteric Christian point of view. And so I will define some of the terminology I use here that's anthroposophic. So in anthroposophy, there's the Christ being, which is an extremely high, or the highest spiritual being who is interested in earth evolution. And that Christ being is part of the Trinity. This is not the same being as Jehovah. And so the Old Testament story is about Jehovah and the Elohim. And then the New Testament story is about Christ being. So I look for, in contemporary spiritual streams, whether or not they are recognizing the actual Christ being as opposed to just Christ consciousness. I'll get into that a little more later. Religions, of course, are made up of many spiritual streams. So, a big religion such as Christianity or Islam or Hinduism, all these are made up of many, many, many hundreds, thousands perhaps, of actual spiritual streams. So it is, there's that big name, but it means almost nothing. It provides very little information unless you can actually discern where the individual human being you're dealing with is working from. Steiner described that folk souls and archangels of a group. So folk souls are considered archangels of a group of people, usually bound by an ethnic or cultural basis. So, there would be a folk soul of America, even though America is not necessarily ethnically connected. It is a group of people who are working from the same geographic space. And archangels are I guess, drawn to any group, especially a group that is working together in a cohesive sense. And so this can be true for completely secular groups as well as spiritual or religious groups. And in anthroposophical terminology, archangels and angels can be either beneficial or fallen. So just because they are, the term angel or archangel refers to a spiritual being who is more evolved than the human being, such as more powerful, has a different level of consciousness, but it does not automatically imply that they are good or beneficial to the human being. And it's that's something to be conscientious of in using that term in the anthroposophical context. I've been reading this book series, which is called The Esoteric Lessons. It's GA 2661, GA 2662, and 3. And so it's 3 books. And what's particularly interesting about them is that these are the notes taken by students during Steiner's esoteric lessons, which were given to people who were very committed to the movement in that part of Germany and Switzerland at that period of time. So what's fascinating about those 3 books is they start with notes from 1904 and they go all the way through, I think, 1923. I've only read to the end of the 1912 one. And so you can see Steiner's own progression as a teacher as he works with what is first people in the Theosophical Society, and then it splits into the Anthroposophical Society, or the German section that Steiner's involved with splits from the Theosophical Society because of this understanding that Steiner had about the actual Christ being. So I have this slide up, and I want to put it in the context of this list on the left was described in the earlier lessons, and what Steiner appeared to indicate is that the Theosophical Society chose to follow masters that were different than the ones that Steiner was following. So Steiner was following the Master Jesus and the Christian Rosenkreuz guides or masters, we'll say. And the Theosophical Society was following the Kutumi and the Moria. And these sorts of lists are always like, who knows? I don't know for sure. But Steiner did speak pretty extensively about the incarnation lineage of Master Jesus and Christian Rosenkreuz. And to be clear, the Jesus story in Anthroposophy is extremely complicated, and I'm not going to talk about it here. But remember, the Christ being incarnates into the Jesus body. And in that sense, it is very different from some mainstream conceptions of Christianity. And the individual named Master Jesus, listed there, is this extremely high initiate, to use the anthroposophical term, who was at one point Zoroaster and then had several incarnations that led to an incarnation in the body of the Matthew Gospel. The Christian Rosenkreuz individual had many incarnations, of course, but the ones that we're most familiar with as names are Lazarus, John the Evangelist, Saint Germain. And then, the others are not referenced in Anthroposophy at all. I looked these up after seeing them in these very early lectures, 1904, 1905 lectures when Steiner was working with the Theosophical Society. And so I was curious who the Theosophical Society was saying these individuals are incarnations of. And that's where this Pythagoras or Abraham, St. Paul, that's where that information comes from. The Venetian master, this is also from these Theosophical Society records, is apparently this artist whose work I've been using here, Paolo Veronese. So that's the Wedding at Cana, Feast in the House of Levi, Juno showering gifts on Venetia. I was unfamiliar with this artist, but I love bright, colorful Renaissance style art. So that was interesting to be able to use. So around 1912, the Anthroposophical Society clearly emerged and separated. It was over this split with the Theosophical Society because the Theosophical Society was saying that that Krishnamurti, who was then, around 12, maybe 15, was they were saying he was the second coming of Christ, and Steiner knew this to be not true. And actually, Krishnamurti himself, as an adult, recognized that it was not true, and so that was the cause of the split with the Theosophical Society, and the reason there is this lineage that has a lot of shared language, but actually a very, very different present day spiritual stream. And so on the right-hand side of the screen, we have these ones who are understood to be the masters associated with the Anthroposophical Society, Master Jesus, the Zoroaster lineage, the Christian Rosenkreutz individuality, John the Baptist, who is also understood to incarnate as Raphael in Ovalis, and Mani, who is supposed to be very important for humanity in the distant future. It's hard to understand the role of Mani today. And then Buddha, but Buddha is no longer incarnating. So this is another thing too that I try to navigate when I'm thinking about these things, particularly in the contemporary world, because in Buddha is considered an extremely, extremely important individuality in anthroposophy. And the idea, as I've heard it or read it, is that Buddha was the first to go through the transfiguration, but he did not go through the resurrection. And so Jesus Christ went through the transfiguration and the resurrection. So it represents another evolution of the possibility for the human being. What happens to spiritual streams over time? Well, again, there's this idea. Okay, so the masters who we talked about on this previous page are human beings. They're extremely advanced human beings. So one question, as I referred to, is do they continue to incarnate? Do they stay with the same group or stream? And the answer to that appears to be no, of course not. Archangels also guide these spiritual streams. That's a picture of Michael. And there are many archangels whose names, you wouldn't recognize because they're unknown, but they're there for any group. And but there are two primary paths that one can use to discern what type of a spiritual stream it is. One is continuing to incarnate. The human being must continue to choose to incarnate in service of humanity. And the other is there's the aim of getting out of the wheel of incarnations, because then one has bliss or oneness or heaven or whatever. And this is probably clear from how I'm presenting this. The anthroposophical path is very clearly one must continue to incarnate in service of humanity. And Buddha is an exception that I don't understand, but Buddha implies that a being has reached a state where they are able to be of service in some other way. And that is the story told by Steiner about Buddha. This is from How to Know Higher Worlds, my favorite book, chapter 10, and it describes that if a person prefers one's own premature elevation to the supersensible world, meaning getting out of the wheel of incarnations in order to have that bliss that is available, then the stream of human evolution will flow over and past him. And in this, to really understand this in context, one would need to read the chapter. But in this chapter, Steiner is essentially saying that if one tries to get out of that wheel of incarnations, it is not following the white path. And it's also not assumed that somebody would follow the white path because the temptations are real. They are really, really real. And it's us when we're incarnated now, it's very hard to imagine that because, we are very protected by our sense world incarnation. But if you've ever had a lucid dream, perhaps, you might be able to recognize that the protections of the sense world don't apply in the spiritual world or in whatever version of the spiritual world we have the ability to understand in that way. And so it I believe what is said here, that until one is very, very pure and not self-seeking at all, it would be extremely challenging to make the right choice. Changing topic slightly. So, ecumenism, that is a word from Christianity, but I'm using it here in the broader context, which is, I'm using it as an analogy for the modern kind of New Age oneness. And so, of course, oneness is true. Like, that's a truth. But everything has its correct time for the human being in the evolution that we're in. And just like, the communist ideals for the human being at the evolution we're in are wrong, yet they might be to enact, but they might be correct in 3,000 years when more people have really come to a way of selflessness and service to their neighbor. But right now, they lead to totalitarian systems because the people, the leaders who end up enacting them, are not in true service to their neighbors. So everything has a correct time. That is a key concept in anthroposophy. And if something happens at the wrong time, it actually is it's sinful or demonic. So this New Age concept of oneness and all is good and all is well and one world, one health, one. This is a truth being used as a delusion. And so truth used as delusion is really a very important thing to understand while discerning where a spiritual stream is actually working out of. And one needs to be able to look at the proposed path and try to estimate, using our actual intellectual and emotional abilities, where does the path lead? Does it lead to top-down control? Does it lead to chaos? Does it lead to ethical individualism? That, by the way, is the term for the philosophy that Steiner promoted before he was speaking as a spiritual teacher. The Philosophy of Freedom is the book that's most associated with that term of ethical individualism. And, again, from my point of view, does the spiritual stream actually recognize the Christ and not just Christ consciousness, which is that's like sunlight, but no sun. So put on the right-hand side of the screen, putting this in anthroposophic terminology, to try to escape all earth incarnation or to claim everything is one or all is bliss, that's luciferic in anthroposophic terminology. And these things have very specific meanings that take a while to understand. To ignore the spirit, to go into materialism, That's Ahrimanic, which is also an adversarial force, what you could call a demon or a devil or Satan. In another way that these two terms are used is Ahriman means Satan, Lucifer means devil. And so the Christ way, the middle way, is understood as continuing to work on transforming the earth through selflessness and beauty, true, good, and beautiful. Right. And I've added this again because these 12 world views, I want to go back to the idea of the 12 masters. So only listed here are 7, and then there are others working in a more hidden way. That's the idea behind this, masters who are guiding humanity on a beneficial path and working together, even if they're not incarnated in the same location, they're able to work together in a spiritual sense. And the idea is that they all represent a different and true perspective or worldview. And so I was intrigued when I looked this up earlier today. This Serapis, or I think the name is actually Serapis Bey, was associated with Confucius and Plato. And so you have this thinker vibe. The kind of essence of Abraham and King Arthur, one can see that it's a strong masculine leader vibe. Or Pythagoras and St. Francis, there's a purity vibe. And, John the Evangelist is the one who wrote the Gospel of John as well as the book of Revelation. And so if you read the book of Revelation several times and read the Gospel of John too, what is understood about these, that essence is, how do I explain this? It is associated with this updated clairvoyance, this updated way of understanding the sense world and the scientific world. It's very confusing that Steiner called anthroposophy also, he called it spiritual science, because to us that seems like, why use that name? And actually, the more that I understand about the Christian Rosenkreuz lineage and the John the Evangelist work and even the Saint Germain lineage, it is all about this, what we could call the royal art, the transformation of the physical world using science as it keeps getting updated. And I feel like I'm doing a very poor job of putting that into words, but there's like pictures in my head that if I had time to, paint this stuff up, as I've said, I wish there was a really amazing painting series from the Renaissance of the Book of Revelation. Going back to, okay, there. Yeah, so this is where I was going to wrap up today. And yeah, thank you. Let me stop sharing the screen. And thank you for listening. See, my dog knows I'm done. That's a dog who has been listening to a lot of conversations over Zoom in the past 5 years. Have a great day.